My name is Ronald Turner, and 2 months ago my own son buried me on paper. While I lay in a coma, tubes in my arms and machines breathing for me, Mark declared me dead. They forged my death certificate, held a funeral, and began carving up my company like vultures. I woke up in a hospital room, to silence no visitors, no family, just a nurse who called my survival a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a second chance, and I used it. The moment I walked into my own funeral and locked eyes with my son giving the eulogy. That was the day the lies began to crumble. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, truth, and quiet revenge, I want to ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Hit subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more stories just like this one. I remember the first sound. A steady beep, low and insistent, like it was trying to pull me back from someplace far away. My chest hurt deep, dull, like something heavy had been pressing on it for days. My fingers twitched against stiff sheets, and the sterile scent of disinfectant made my throat clench. I opened my eyes slowly, squinting at the harsh light above me. A crack ran along the ceiling like a frozen bolt of lightning. For a second, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who I was. But then it came back, my name, Ronald Turner, 62, business owner, father. And something else. A truck rain headlights, metal crunching. The accident. My body screamed in silence as I tried to move. Pain rippled through my ribs like broken glass. I croaked out something, anything, but it came out as a dry rasp. That's when the nurse appeared. Her name tag said Janet. She gasped when she saw my eyes open. "Mr. Turner, oh my goodness, you're awake." Her voice cracked with something between joy and disbelief. She rushed off before I could respond, shouting for the doctor. I was still too dazed to understand why she seemed so shocked. When Dr. Clark entered the room, he was calm, clinical. "Mr. Turner," he said with practiced kindness, "you've been in a coma for 2 months. After the accident, it's a miracle you're awake." I blinked. 2 months. My lips formed the question before I could stop them. Did my family come? A hesitation, a glance at Janet, then the kind of tone you use when delivering bad news to children. They were informed. "I'm sure they'll be here soon." But they weren't. Not then. Not the next morning. Not even after I was cleared to be discharged. No phone calls, no flowers, not even a voicemail. The phone I'd had in my pocket was returned to me, dead screen cracked, long forgotten in a plastic bag. My wallet was still there. So were my house keys. But my world had gone silent. The son I raised. The daughter-in-law I welcomed. They knew. They just didn't care. I lay in that bed staring at the door, hoping it would open, hoping for some explanation. But it stayed shut. That was when the dread shifted into something colder. Not sadness, not confusion, clarity. If they weren't here and if no one had come in all this time, then something had happened. Or worse, something had been done. By the time I called for the nurse again, my mind had cleared enough to say it plainly. "I want to go home tomorrow." She tried to protest, but I saw it in her eyes. I wasn't some frail patient anymore. I was a man coming back from the dead. Not just to live, but to ask questions. The taxi pulled up to the curb outside my house just after sunrise. The driver didn't speak much, and I was grateful for the silence. My body ached from the ride, every bump in the road sending sparks through my ribs and legs. I handed him a crumpled 20, grabbed my plastic bag of belongings, and stepped out into the spring air. The first thing I noticed was the lawn. Overgrown. Dandelions had claimed it like weeds reclaiming a battlefield. My mailbox sagged forward, stuffed with weeks of mail, some yellowed with rain and time. This wasn't how I left it. I stood still for a moment, letting the reality settle in. No one had been here. Not Mark. Not Kristen. No neighborly gesture to cut the grass, no sign of care. Just a house abandoned, as if the man who lived in it really had died. I climbed the porch slowly, my knees trembling under the weight of disuse. The lock on the door was stiff, and it took a moment to turn the key. When the door creaked open, the smell hit me. Damp wood, stale air, the must of dust and something forgotten. The oak table in the foyer was coated in a film of gray. The cushion on the armchair in the living room still held the shape of my last nap, like the house had been frozen in time. Except for the silence. That was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. A kind of silence that screamed betrayal. I limped to the kitchen, opened the fridge out of instinct. Empty. No power. The cat's bowl in the corner sat dry, crusted. Rusty. My cat. Gone. I didn't know if someone had taken him, or if he'd starved, or if he'd simply left when no one came back. That thought stung worse than the bruises. I gripped the counter, breathing through the ache. This was my house. My life. And yet it felt like I didn't belong in it anymore. I forced myself upstairs, each step a battle. The bedroom was untouched. Drawers still full. The sheets wrinkled but clean. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the weight of 2 months and 1,000 questions settle into my bones. I stared at the photo on the dresser. Me, Mark, and Kristen. Christmas. Smiles too wide, laughter too practiced. I should have seen it. The way Mark had flinched when I said I hadn't updated my will yet. The way Kristen's eyes lit up every time I mentioned the company's latest profits. I hadn't seen ambition then. I'd seen family. That was my mistake. I stood again, weaker now than I liked, and looked out the window. Across the street, Marjorie's porch light flickered. She'd been my neighbor for over 20 years. A good woman, sharp eyes. As I turned away, the doorbell rang sharp and sudden. I froze. No one knew I was home. No one was supposed to. I made my way down one slow step at a time and opened the door. Marjorie stood there, eyes wide, her hands clutching the railing like she'd seen a ghost. "Ronald Turner," she whispered. "You're alive," I nodded. "Of course I am." Her lips trembled. But they said you were dead. They're holding your memorial. Right now." Her words hit harder than the accident ever did. A memorial. Today. Right now. While I stood on my own porch with my chest still sore and my legs barely steady, my son was somewhere reading a eulogy telling the town I was gone. I blinked at Marjorie, trying to make sense of what she had said. At St. Luke's, she added, her voice breaking. "The whole town is there," Mark said. "He said you didn't make it after the accident, that you were gone." My breath caught in my throat. Gone. Not missing. Not hospitalized. Gone. Declared dead. I stepped back into the foyer, my knees almost buckling beneath me. My mind raced, each piece falling into place with cruel precision. No calls, no visits, no flowers. Just silence. Now I knew why. They didn't ignore me. They buried me. "Thank you, Marjorie," I said softly. Not because I had nothing else to say, but because anything else would have spilled out like fire. She reached out and squeezed my arm. "I can drive you," she offered. I shook my head. "No, I need the walk. 10 minutes, she'd said. Down Elm Street, just past the park." I knew the way. I'd walked it 100 times back when Mark was little and we'd go for donuts after church. Now he was in that church, pretending to grieve. I grabbed my jacket from the closet and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror by the door. Sunken eyes, sallow skin, silver stubble that had once been neatly shaved. I looked like a ghost. fitting. Outside, the morning air was crisp, full of spring blossoms and betrayal. My feet moved slowly but with growing purpose. The world blurred past familiar houses, kids on bikes, a jogger passing with earbuds in, but all I saw was that church steeple rising like a blade over Hartford's skyline. I walked faster. My ribs protested, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was still alive, still capable, still in control. The bells rang as I turned the final corner, their toll mournful and slow. I could hear voices now, low and reverent, leaking out through the stained glass windows of St. Luke's. The sidewalk in front of the church was lined with parked cars, black dresses, suits. I recognized the faces filing in. Co-workers, old friends, neighbors, all there to mourn a man who hadn't died. I climbed the front steps, each one a reckoning. The heavy oak doors stood shut, a barrier between truth and the lie my son had built. I paused at the top, placing my hand on the iron handle. A deep breath filled my lungs, shaking but sure. They thought I was dead. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air inside St. Luke's was thick with incense and pretense. Candles flickered along the altar, casting shadows that danced across the stained glass windows. The scent of wax and old wood mingled with something sour in my throat, disgust. I stood in the doorway for a beat too long, letting my silhouette fill the entrance. A few heads turned, then more, then silence. All at once the organ stopped, the murmurs died, and every pair of eyes turned toward me. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through brittle leaves. A woman near the back let out a shaky, "Oh my Lord," while someone else whispered, "Is that—" I scanned the pews until I saw him. Mark, standing at the front, one hand clutching the pulpit, the other resting near a framed photo of me, smiling, alive, frozen in time. Kristen sat in the front row, dabbing fake tears with a black handkerchief. When they turned and saw me, it was as if gravity had shifted. Mark's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Kristen's hand flew to her chest. I stepped forward, slow and steady, the echo of my footsteps sharp against the church floor. "You're celebrating a little early, aren't you?" I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. The effect was instant. Half the congregation rose, unsure whether to approach or retreat. I saw confusion, fear, awe, every face frozen in a moment none of them would forget. Mark finally found his voice. "Dad," he choked like the word burned coming out. "I didn't stop walking. You buried me, Mark. You and her." I gestured toward Kristen, who still hadn't stood. Her eyes darted like a cornered animal. "You lied to everyone. Told them I was dead." "Why?" "So you could take what I built." He stumbled forward, his hand reaching for my arm, but I pulled away before he could touch me. "You don't get to touch me. Not today." "It was a mistake," he said quickly, his voice tight with panic. "We thought you were gone. We didn't know." "You didn't check," I snapped. 2 months, no visit, no call, just paperwork, just profit. I turned to the congregation, my voice rising. "This isn't a memorial. This is a theft. I'm not dead. I'm not done. And I'm not going anywhere." A ripple of gasps spread again. Whispers surged like a tide. Kristen stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt with trembling fingers. "Ronald, please," she said, in that honeyed tone I now knew too well. "Let's talk privately." I laughed, short, bitter. "Oh, we'll talk. But not here. Not now. And not on your terms." Mark looked like he might faint. I leaned closer, my voice a whisper only he could hear. "You've played your hand, son, and now everyone's watching. I turned without waiting for a reply. The church doors slammed behind me as I stepped back into the sunlight. The air felt lighter, sharper. The lie had cracked. The truth had entered the room, and the reckoning had begun. I didn't look back as I descended the church steps. The spring breeze hit my face like cold steel, and for the first time in 2 months, I felt fully awake. Behind me, voices buzzed, doors creaked, feet shuffled in confusion. Let them talk. Let them spin their theories. The man they buried had walked out under his own power, and they couldn't control that. I walked straight down the sidewalk past rows of blooming dogwoods and cracked pavement until the noise faded. My ribs ached. My legs burned, but I kept going. I needed space. I needed answers. Frank, my oldest friend and more importantly, my lawyer. He'd always told me to keep my paperwork tight, my will clean, my decisions firm. I hadn't listened closely enough. His office was still a few blocks away, tucked above a bakery that always smelled like burnt cinnamon rolls. I made it there slower than I wanted, holding the stair rail tighter than I let on. The receptionist looked up from behind her desk and blinked twice before her mouth fell open. "Mr. Turner," she breathed like she was seeing something unnatural. I gave her a faint nod. "Is Frank in?" Moments later, I was in his office, sitting in the same leather chair I'd used for 2 decades. Frank stared at me for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "You look like hell," he said. "And you just walked into your own funeral?" "Yeah," I said, voice low. "They really went all out. Flowers, photo, crocodile tears." He didn't smile. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. They didn't just plan a funeral, Ron. They planned a transfer of power. A forged death certificate filed with the county. Kristen hired a lawyer from Boston, slick, expensive. Your company's already in the early stages of sale. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the folder. Your name, he continued, tapping, the document is legally marked as deceased. They've changed the will, the assets, everything. If you hadn't shown up today in person, this would have gone through clean. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, the anger simmering under my skin. They started this while I was in a coma, while I couldn't fight back. They thought you wouldn't wake up, he said. Or maybe they didn't care. My hands curled into fists. They wanted everything, the company, the house, the savings. Frank studied me for a beat. You want to fight, I want to bury them in the truth, I said, voice calm. No theatrics, just facts, hard, cold, public facts. Then we start with freezing the sale, he said. Injunction, emergency hearing, and press. You'll need someone to shine a light on their lies. I nodded slowly. I already knew who. Elaine Harper, reporter, smart, ruthless, honest. This wasn't just about legal paperwork anymore. They'd buried me to take my life. Now I was going to take back every piece of it and make sure the world saw them for who they really were. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my upstairs bathroom, trying to remember the last time I'd shaved. My hand trembled as I dragged the razor across my jaw. The skin was pale, thinner than I remembered. My face didn't belong to me, it belonged to someone older, someone who had been through something. But beneath the hollowed cheeks and tired eyes, I could still see myself. Ronald Turner. Not a corpse. Not a ghost. A man with a name, a past, and a reason to fight. By 9:30, I was walking up the steps to the Hartford Chronicle building. The newsroom had always been a place of controlled chaos, phones ringing, reporters shouting over each other, the scent of cheap coffee hanging in the air like a second skin. It hadn't changed. Elaine Harper met me in the lobby, her sharp eyes flicking over me, as if she were scanning for wounds not visible to the public. You ready? She asked. Not kindly, not cruelly, just directly. I nodded. Let's get this started. Her office was small, cluttered with paper whiteboards scribbled with half-formed headlines, and a coffee mug that said, "Trust me, I'm the problem." She gestured for me to sit, then opened her laptop. Frank gave me the basics, she said. I want it from you. Every detail, no filters, I told her. About the accident, the hospital. Waking up to an empty room, a silent phone, a nurse's pity. I told her about the silence that grew louder with every passing day, until the only conclusion left was the truth my son had used my absence to erase me. I told her about the walk to the church the moment those heavy oak doors opened, the silence that fell when I stepped into the lie they'd built. Elaine didn't interrupt. She typed quickly occasionally, underlining something or flagging it in red. When I finished, she sat back, fingers steepled under her chin. You have evidence? She asked. I opened the folder Frank had given me and slid it across the desk. Forged death certificate, altered will, corporate sale documents, signatures that aren't mine, and witnesses. I've got people from my company who saw them pushing papers before I was even out of the ICU. She flipped through it, nodding slowly. This is gold, she said. We can print this. Front page, but it'll hit hard, and they'll hit back. I want them to, I said. They buried me to steal what I built. I want them to feel exposed out in the open. No shadows to hide in. Elaine tapped her keyboard, then looked back at me. We'll need quotes, records, timelines, and I'll want to talk to some of those employees myself. I'll line them up, I said, starting with Joe. He's been with me for 20 years. Mark tried to pressure him into signing off on the sale. He refused. Her eyes lit up. Perfect. Ronald, you're not just taking back your life. You're rewriting your obituary with ink they can't erase. I exhaled slowly. The storm was coming, but for once I was the one holding the lightning. I met Joe later that afternoon in the break room of the old building we once called our headquarters. It still smelled like coffee burned into ceramic and wood polish from the days I'd mopped the floors myself. Joe looked older than I remembered, grayer, slower, but when he saw me, his expression cracked into something I hadn't seen in weeks. Recognition without hesitation. Boss, he said, standing to shake my hand. His grip was solid. Hell, we thought you were, I know I cut in. But you didn't believe it, did you? He shook his head. Didn't sit right. No funeral details, no hospital statement. Kristen just showed up and said you passed after surgery. Next thing I know, she and Mark are handing me contracts to sign. I raised an eyebrow. They tried to get you to approve the sale. Twice, he said. Pushed hard. Said it was what you wanted. Said you gave them power of attorney before things got bad. But the signatures looked off, and their timing too fast. You were still on machines, and they were out for blood. I leaned forward. You refused. Of course I did, Joe said. Me and a few of the old-timers, you trained us better than that. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't expect loyalty, not after all I'd just seen. But here it was, quiet, firm waiting. Elaine's going to need your statement, I said. Clear, honest, and on the record. He nodded without hesitation. Whatever you need, Ron. I gave him a small smile. Then we're not done yet. After leaving Joe, I walked the long way back toward town. My ribs ached, and the wind cut sharper than it should have in May, but I didn't stop. As I passed a newsstand, I saw the Hartford Chronicle's afternoon edition stacked high. Elaine hadn't wasted time. The headline read, "Local businessman declared dead, then walks into his own funeral." My name was printed just beneath it in bold. I grabbed a copy, scanned the front page. The tone was measured factual, but every line hit like a hammer. a prominent company owner, a forged death certificate, property transfer attempts, a pending sale to out-of-state developers, all of it laid bare. She'd even included a photo of me just outside the church steps, sunlight catching the stunned faces behind me. I kept walking, paper tucked under my arm, feeling like a man both hunted and holding the map. Back at home, I set the newspaper on the kitchen table and stared at the headlines. Somewhere out there, Mark and Kristen were reading the same article. I imagined her pacing their living room phone in hand voice, sharp and desperate. I imagined Mark sitting in silence, the weight of it settling in. They thought they'd planned it perfectly: bury me, sell the company, split the cash, and rewrite the story. But I had a pulse. I had proof. And now I had a voice in the paper, not in the ground. They had made their move. Now it was my turn to play. The following morning, the phone rang just after sunrise. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. A sharp voice greeted me on the other end. "Mr. Turner, this is Alan Voss. I represent your son and daughter-in-law." I didn't say a word, just let the silence stretch. He continued. "They're concerned about your recent actions. The public spectacle, the newspaper article, the accusations. It's causing emotional distress." I finally spoke. "You mean it's causing exposure? They're not distressed, they're caught." He paused, then shifted his tone to something cooler. "Given your age and recent health event, we're filing a motion to challenge your legal competency. You may want to prepare." "You mean to say," I replied, my voice calm, "that a man who walked into his own funeral and showed the town he was very much alive might not be mentally fit? The court will decide," he said. "Good day, Mr. Turner." The line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a long moment. It wasn't just a threat, it was their next move. They couldn't disprove the documents, so they'd try to discredit me instead. I called Frank immediately. "They're contesting my competency," I said. He sighed as if he'd been expecting it. "They'll weaponize your coma, your age, the stress. It's weak, but it's a distraction tactic. We'll fight it." "Then let's stay ahead," I said. "We need more statements. More people who've seen them scheming while I was out." "Agreed," Frank replied. "And get a full medical evaluation from someone reputable. We'll need documentation." I hung up and sat in the kitchen, the early light casting soft gold across the floor. They were coming for me, but not with fists, with paperwork, strategy, spin. I knew that kind of fight. I'd built a company in a town full of backroom politics and tight-lipped boardrooms. I'd been outmaneuvered before, but never like this. I grabbed my coat and walked 2 blocks to Elaine's apartment. She opened the door with a knowing look. "They're trying to make you out to be crazy, aren't they?" I nodded. "You've dealt with people like this before too many times," she said. "When they run out of truth, they try to silence the truth teller." Inside, her kitchen table was already covered in files. She was steps ahead, like always. "I reached out to a secretary from your company," she said, flipping open a folder. She overheard Kristen on a call with the buyers, pushing to close quickly, before any surprises came up. I raised an eyebrow. "She's willing to go on record she's furious," Elaine replied. "She loved working for you. She knew something was wrong when Kristen stopped answering questions about your health and told everyone to stop asking." I sank into the chair, letting the moment wash over me. The circle was tightening. Their grip was slipping. But we had to be faster. "Let's publish again," I said. "Call it part 2. We shine the light even brighter." Elaine grinned. "I thought you'd say that." We both looked at the growing stack of evidence on her table. Their story was falling apart. Ours was just beginning. By noon the next day, Elaine's follow-up article hit the stands. This time, the headline didn't pull punches. Forged papers, false death, what Mark Turner didn't want you to know. Beneath it, a bold subheading, new evidence surfaces in Ronald Turner's fight for the truth. My phone lit up with messages, some from old friends, some from local business owners, even a former councilman I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them had read the piece. All of them had something to say. Ron, I had no idea. If there's anything I can do, you've got our support. It felt like the tide had shifted. The whispers had become a conversation, and that conversation was beginning to shape the public perception. But not everyone was supportive. Kristen made her move that afternoon. I was sipping coffee on the porch when my phone buzzed again. This time it was a social media post. Her face, flawless, composed, camera-ready, filled the screen. The caption was heavy with sadness and feigned dignity. Our family is devastated. Ronald's return has been emotionally overwhelming. His health concerns have clearly taken a toll. We ask for compassion and privacy during this fragile time. The comments were a flood of pity. Stay strong, Kristen. He's probably confused. She doesn't deserve this. I could practically hear her voice as I read it, rehearsed and hollow. She wasn't just spinning the narrative, she was rewriting the script, painting herself as the grieving daughter-in-law, and me as the bitter, delusional old man who had wandered back from the edge of death with a vendetta. I clenched my jaw and closed the app. I wouldn't fight her in the comment section. I'd fight her with truth, with facts, with people who knew better. That evening, I met Elaine again, this time at a corner table in the PAB. Her laptop was already open, her fingers flying across the keys. She looked up as I sat down. Saw Kristen's post. Yeah, she's scared, Elaine said. This is a preemptive strike. She's trying to control the fallout before the next shoe drops. Then we drop it, I said. Hard. Elaine turned the screen toward me. I've already got 2 more employees willing to speak on record. One from accounting, one from HR. Both confirm Kristen and Mark started moving assets weeks after your accident, before a single legal death certificate was filed. I stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. They weren't waiting for a death. They were planning a takeover. Exactly. Elaine's voice was tight. This wasn't grief. This was greed with a deadline. I nodded slowly. I want the next article to be clear. Names, timelines, documents. I don't care if it rattles their lawyers or makes the whole town uncomfortable. I'm done being buried. Elaine's lips curved into a grim smile. Then let's rattle some cages. The bartender brought our drinks, and as I lifted mine, I looked out the window toward the darkened skyline. Kristen had made her move. Now the gloves were off. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting to win. The article dropped 2 days later. Elaine didn't hold back. She opened with the forged death certificate, broke down the altered will, and laid out the timeline that proved Mark and Kristen began gutting my company before my doctors had even stopped calling me critical. The piece quoted Joe and the HR lead by name. It cited transaction records. It exposed the Boston attorney who filed the transfer paperwork. She even ended with a line that made me pause. Ronald Turner wasn't lost. He was stolen. And now he's back to take back what's his. By noon, it was the only thing people in Hartford were talking about. I passed the bakery near Main Street and saw a group of city employees huddled around a bench, all with copies of the Chronicle in their hands. One of them looked up and locked eyes with me. She gave a short nod, just enough to say, "I believe you." I returned the gesture and kept walking. I wasn't looking for applause. I was looking for accountability. And now that the town had seen the receipts, Mark and Kristen were running out of places to hide. Still, I knew better than to celebrate early. That afternoon, Frank called with an update. Their attorney filed a motion to invalidate the freeze on the company sale, he said. They're claiming you're emotionally unstable and mentally compromised. Based on what I asked, though I already knew. Kristen's post, Frank said. Some selectively edited voicemail from you at the hospital, and a medical opinion from a physician they somehow convinced to weigh in without even meeting you. They're doubling down. They're desperate, Frank replied. But that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. I walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the yard I once kept like a golf course. Now it was a field of weeds and wild edges. Like everything they'd touched, it had been let go. We hit them again, I said. No rest. No letting up. That evening, I met with Elaine one more time at her apartment. She poured us both coffee, her cat curling at her feet. Tomorrow's piece, she said, handing me the printout, is the last one, unless they take it to court. I scanned the headline, "He Was Never Gone, the Real Story Behind Hartford's Most Brazen Betrayal." The subhead was even stronger. First-hand accounts, forged documents, and what's next for the man who came back from the dead. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked, sitting across from me. "You won't be able to take any of it back." "I don't want to," I said. "They started this. I'm just finishing it." We sat in silence for a long while, the kind that didn't feel empty, the kind that said everything had shifted. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. I had lived through betrayal, through silence, through being erased. But now I was building something stronger, louder. The truth had legs, and tomorrow it would run. I didn't sleep much the night before the article went live. My body was exhausted, but my mind ran like an engine that wouldn't shut off. I kept thinking about the little details, things I'd ignored before the accident. The way Kristen asked about my signature habits over dinner, how Mark started visiting the office more often, not to help, but to snoop. They'd been planting seeds for this betrayal long before the wreck. I just hadn't been ready to believe my own blood could pull the trigger. But now I knew better. At 7:30 the next morning, the paper hit every corner stand in town. By 8, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Some calls I ignored, some I took. And then one came through from a name I hadn't seen in years, Joe's daughter Claire. She'd interned at my company a decade ago, sharp as a tack even back then. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice tight. "I think you need to see something. It's about the Boston lawyer, Kristen's guy. I work in regulatory now." A few flags went up. 10 minutes later, I was on my way to her office. Claire met me in the lobby with a folder already in hand. "He's done this before," she said as we sat in a quiet side room. "Represented spouses in asset transfers under shady pretenses. 2 complaints were filed against him last year, one settled quietly. The others still pending." She slid the documents across the table. "It's a pattern. Kristen didn't just find someone to help. She found someone who knew how to bury a paper trail." I stared at the documents, fury rising under my skin like boiling tar. "You're sure about this?" "I triple-checked," she said. "You have enough here to file a formal ethics complaint, maybe even open a broader investigation." I thanked her and took the folder back to Frank. His eyes lit up the moment he flipped through it. "This changes things," he muttered. "We're not just defending your rights anymore, we're proving intent to defraud. This isn't sloppy, it's criminal." He started drafting the formal complaint that afternoon. As he worked, I sat in the chair across from his desk, watching the wheels turn. I wasn't just pushing back anymore. I was peeling back layers. The truth didn't just expose Mark and Kristen, it implicated the people they brought in to help. People who knew better. People who profited anyway. That night I stood at my kitchen sink, staring out at the dark lawn. My home still felt strange, like a place I hadn't earned my way back into. But the lights were on. The water ran. My name was still on the deed. And soon everyone in that courtroom would know exactly what had happened behind closed doors. Kristen wanted to orchestrate a quiet handoff, a clean erasure. Instead, she'd triggered something much louder. I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The next few days passed like controlled fire. Every move I made had a purpose. Every phone call, every meeting, every word spoken was measured. Kristen and Mark had underestimated me. They'd buried me too early, and now that I was back, they were scrambling to bury their tracks instead. But the ground was shifting beneath them. Elaine met me at a cafe on Monday morning, a thin stack of papers in her hand. 3 more employees reached out after the last article, she said, sliding the pages across the table. All of them have receipts, emails, text messages, calendar logs. It's a disaster for your son. I picked up one of the sheets. It was a forwarded message from Mark to the accounting team, dated just 2 weeks after my accident. We'll need access to the full ledger. Ronald won't be returning. Let's accelerate this process. I read it twice. He didn't even try to pretend. That's the thing about people who think they've won, Elaine said. They stop being careful. I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. And people like Kristen, they double down. That same afternoon, Frank filed the official ethics complaint against Kristen's Boston attorney. It was surgical precise dates, conflicting statements, witness affidavits, everything Claire had uncovered. Once that complaint was on the record, it was only a matter of time before someone from the state bar would get involved. That night I received an email that nearly knocked the breath out of me. The buyer, the out-of-state developer Kristen and Mark had tried to sell my company to. He'd seen the articles, he'd seen the documents, and he wanted no part in any of it. His message was cold and legalistic, but the final line stayed with me. My firm has withdrawn all interest in the transaction effective immediately. We do not do business with families in public litigation involving death fraud. It was the first time since I'd woken up that I laughed out loud. It wasn't joy, it was vindication. The sale was officially dead. The company was safe. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't just here to keep what was mine. I wanted to leave something behind that couldn't be twisted, erased, or stolen. At the office, I met with Joe and a few of the old team. We sat around the old oak table in the boardroom, the one Mark never appreciated, and I laid it out plainly. We rebuild, I said. We reinforce the company's structure. We set policies in place so this can never happen again. And when this legal mess is over, we start hiring again. Hartford needs to know we're not just surviving, we're standing tall. Joe nodded, his jaw set with pride. We're with you, Ron. All the way. That night, I sat at my desk staring at the company's original mission statement I'd written in ink 30 years ago. One line stood out, built on trust, grown through action. I had nearly lost everything. But now I was reclaiming it one piece at a time. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection by design. 2 days after the buyer pulled out, Mark called me. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad, he said, his voice stripped of the smugness it once carried. We need to talk. I didn't answer right away. Letting him sit in his own discomfort was the least he deserved. We can meet, I finally said, but not at my house. Not alone. We agreed on neutral ground, a private conference room at Frank's office. When he arrived, he looked different. Older somehow. Not in years, but in weight. The weight of consequence, of exposure. Kristen wasn't with him. I took my seat opposite him and waited. Frank sat quietly at the head of the table, document folder open, pen in hand. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Mark said. We thought, we thought you wouldn't make it. So you skipped grief and went straight to asset distribution, I replied. You didn't wait for a doctor's word, didn't ask for a second opinion. You just handed out funeral programs and forged signatures. It wasn't like that, he muttered, staring at the table. Kristen said we had to act fast or we'd lose everything. The company was exposed. There were debts, there were options I cut in, and not one of them involved burying me while I was still breathing. Mark rubbed his eyes. We were scared. She convinced me it was the only way. I looked at him hard. No, Mark. She didn't convince you. She gave you permission to be what you already were, a coward. You could have waited. You could have checked on me. But you wanted the shortcut, the power, and now it's slipping through your fingers. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. An apology, I shook my head. I want the truth, on record. I want you to admit what you did. I want you to release any claim to the company publicly and legally. You can keep your marriage, your lifestyle, your lies, but you don't get to keep what you tried to steal. Frank slid a prepared statement across the table. This waives your claim to Ronald's estate, business holdings, and intellectual property, he said. It also acknowledges the falsehoods presented in your initial filings. We've included language that protects Ronald from any future legal retaliation. Mark stared at the page like it was a death sentence. Maybe in some ways it was. The death of the man he pretended to be. If I sign this, he said, we're done. We were done the moment you put my name on a certificate of death, I replied. This is just paperwork. He signed, slowly, bitterly, like every stroke cut into him. When he slid the paper back, his hands shook. I stood. Goodbye, Mark. I didn't wait for his reply. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because it was over, but because now finally I held the pen. I wasn't being written out anymore. I was writing the ending myself. The sun was low when I stepped back into the house that evening. Light filtered through the dusty curtains, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence, not the empty, aching kind that greeted me weeks ago, but the kind that waits, the kind that allows space for something new to begin. I made a pot of coffee and took it into the living room, where I sat in the same armchair I used to fall asleep in after long workdays. The newspaper with Elaine's third article still sat on the coffee table, its pages creased from repeated reading. The town knew now. The world even. Mark had signed the release. Kristen had gone quiet. Her social media scrubbed clean, her name disappearing from real estate forums and local investment groups. It was clear she knew the ship was sinking, and she wasn't going down with it. I didn't expect a knock on the door that night, but when it came soft and hesitant, I didn't flinch. I stood, opened it slowly. There stood Joe holding a brown envelope in one hand and a six-pack of cheap beer in the other. Figured you might want company, he said. I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table like we had years ago when we were building the company from nothing, nights of sweat, late invoices, and half-believed optimism. He slid the envelope across the table. More records, he said. Internal emails Kristen sent after the funeral. She was already setting up account transfers, negotiating salaries. It's all there. I didn't open it yet. I just looked at him. Why did you stay through all this, Onmu? You could have walked away. He took a long pull from his beer, then looked me dead in the eye. Because when I was 30, fresh out of the military with nothing to my name, you gave me a shot. No experience, just grit. And I've never forgotten that. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked down. Gratitude didn't come easy to me, not after what I'd just been through. But there it was, quietly filling the room. We talked for another hour, not about lawsuits or statements, but about the early days. The people we'd hired, the projects that almost sank us, the wins that still gave us pride. Before he left, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "It's not over, Ron, but you're winning. Don't stop now." After he left, I sat alone in the dark for a long time. The envelope remained unopened. I didn't need to read what I already knew. I was being handed back the pieces of my life, one document, one voice, one act of truth at a time. This wasn't just a return, it was a rebuilding. Not everything could be fixed. But what mattered, my name, my work, my word, was being restored. And tomorrow I would start building again. Not just a business, a legacy that couldn't be faked, forged, or forgotten. Elaine called me early the next morning. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she'd been up late. "It's time," she said. "The article's ready for review. I want your eyes on it before it hits tomorrow's front page." I met her at her office within the hour. The printout was already waiting on the desk, titled in bold, commanding letters, "Buried Alive, the Man Who Came Back to Reclaim Everything." I sat down across from her and started reading. The first lines pulled no punches. It told the truth with precision and restraint, stripping away sentiment, to expose only the facts. It wasn't angry, but it didn't flinch. It wasn't about revenge, it was about record, evidence, voice. What they'd done, how they'd done it, and how they were losing ground fast. She documented the timeline of my coma, the forged death certificate, the rush to sell the company, the intimidation of employees, and finally, the unraveling, each lie collapsing under the weight of a truth that refused to stay buried. Elaine had woven in quotes from Frank's statements, from Joe, even a short line from Claire. She closed the piece with a powerful paragraph I hadn't expected. In the end, she wrote, "Ronald Turner did not return for vengeance. He returned to finish what he started. Not with anger, but with resolve. Not to punish, but to reclaim." I set the paper down and nodded. "It's perfect," I said. "It's more than perfect. It's honest." She studied me for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. "You know this article will spread further than Hartford, right?" "Good," I said. "Let it. What will you do after this?" I hesitated, then looked toward the window. The city beyond it was small, but it had shaped me. "I'll rebuild, not just the company, the reputation, the message. I want to speak at the community center next month. Tell the story myself. Let people see that being betrayed doesn't make you weak, and coming back doesn't mean coming back angry." She smiled. "That'll hit harder than any headline I could write." We parted ways after coffee. I walked the streets of Hartford with the article folded in my coat pocket. People glanced my way. Some nodded, some smiled. I felt seen, not pitied, not feared. Seen. At the corner bakery, Mrs. Carney waved me in. "Heard it's coming out tomorrow," she said. "You show 'em, Ron." I thanked her and stepped back out into the light. When I returned home, I sat at the desk in my study and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. "They tried to erase me, but I'm the one holding the pen." Then I wrote down dates, names, ideas for the next staff meeting, the next round of hires, maybe even a mentoring program for veterans who needed a second chance the way Joe once did. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt ready. So was I. The last battle had ended. The next chapter was mine to write. I didn't expect them to show up at my door again. Not after the article, not after the legal filings, and especially not after Mark signed everything away. But just after dusk, while the sun was bleeding into the horizon and the front porch lights had barely warmed up, I heard the knock. 3 short taps. Hesitant. I opened the door, and there they were. Mark looked hollow, like sleep hadn't touched him in days. His collar was open tie loose, the posture of a man whose mask had cracked. Kristen stood beside him, perfectly dressed, but her face betrayed the effort it took to maintain the facade. Her lips were tight, her eyes ringed with something that looked more like panic than remorse. I didn't move. "Can we come in?" Mark asked. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remind them they were on my threshold, not their territory. Then I stepped aside without a word. They followed me into the living room, careful not to touch anything, as if even the furniture might turn on them. I remained standing. "Say what you came to say." Kristen was the first to speak, her voice sugar-laced but brittle. "We just wanted to clear the air, Ronald. The articles, the accusations. We didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed once, dry and short. "You forged my death. You sold off my name like it was clearance stock. Don't insult either of us by calling it a misunderstanding." Mark winced. Kristen's expression didn't change. "We panicked," she said. "There was so much pressure. Bills, investors, deadlines. You weren't expected to recover. It felt urgent. You declared me dead within 2 weeks," I said flatly. "That's not urgency. That's convenience." Mark finally found his voice. "I didn't know what to do. Kristen kept saying it was the only way to salvage everything." I thought, "No," I interrupted. "You didn't think. You decided. You saw an opportunity and you took it. Don't come here looking for absolution. You didn't come to make amends. You came because the town turned on you and you're looking for a backdoor to save face." "That's not fair," Kristen snapped. "You think this is easy for us? Do you have any idea what people are saying?" I stared at her, dead calm. "Yes. They're finally saying the truth." She opened her mouth to fire back, but I raised a hand. "You wanted the last word when you thought I was gone." I took it back. "You don't get to write this ending." Mark looked up, his voice cracked and small. "What happens now, you go," I said. "You leave my house, my life, and you stay gone. Whatever comes next for you, for her, it's yours to deal with. I've done my part." They hesitated. Kristen looked ready to argue, but Mark touched her arm. "Let's go," he said. And for once, she listened. I closed the door behind them and locked it, not out of fear, but finality. That chapter was closed. What came next would be built on truth alone. The house felt different after they left, quiet, but not tense. For weeks, the walls had held the echo of unanswered questions, betrayal, silence. Now it felt like they could finally exhale. I sat in the dining room alone for a long while, letting the stillness settle. No arguments, no schemes, no carefully measured lies dressed up as concern, just me and peace. The next morning, I met Elaine at the community center. We were scheduled to finalize the details for my talk next week. She greeted me with a clipboard in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. I nodded. "I've been ready since the moment I opened those church doors." The community center's event coordinator walked us through the setup, just a modest stage, folding chairs, a single microphone. It was simple. That's how I wanted it. No grandeur, just space for truth to land. "You'll have about 40 minutes, Elaine said as we stepped into the small auditorium. "After that, Q&A if you're up for it. But no pressure. I want them to ask," I replied. "If one person sitting out there has been through what I've been through or worse, and they think silence is their only option, I want to be the one who proves them wrong." She smiled faintly. "That's why this matters." I spent the rest of the day writing out the points I wanted to hit. Not a script, just notes, memories, lessons, warnings. It wasn't about shaming Mark and Kristen publicly. that had already played out. This was about something deeper, telling people how quickly trust can be weaponized, how fragile a life's work really is, and how dignity is never theirs to steal. That evening, I found myself walking past the office building again, the company I built from sweat and vision, now mine again. The lights were on. Inside, I saw Joe sitting in the conference room with two junior managers laughing about something over a stack of blueprints. I didn't go in. I just stood there for a minute watching the place come back to life. No press, no ceremony, just honest work. That's what survival looks like, I thought. Not the dramatic moments, not the courtroom victories or the front-page headlines, but the quiet return to normalcy, to contribution, to purpose. Back at home, I placed the notes for the speech on the nightstand and poured a small glass of bourbon. I sat by the window and watched as Hartford settled into its evening rhythm, streetlights, flickering neighbors, walking dogs, someone across the block dragging out the trash bins, life undisturbed. That was the real win. They had tried to take it all: my name, my business, my presence. They forged the paperwork and wore the grief like a costume. But here I was, very much alive, very much present, and finally fully seen. And this time, everything that came next would be on my terms. The day of the talk arrived with a cool breeze and gray skies, like Hartford itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, tying a navy blue tie I hadn't worn since before the accident. My hands moved slowly, deliberately. Not because I was nervous, but because this moment deserved care. I wasn't dressing for battle anymore. I was dressing for testimony. At the community center, the chairs filled faster than I expected. Familiar faces dotted the room, employees, neighbors, even a few old friends I hadn't seen since the hospital. Frank sat in the second row with a folder tucked under his arm, always prepared. Elaine stood near the back, notebook in hand, but her eyes were on me. She gave a subtle nod. I stepped onto the small stage. The microphone squealed once before quieting, and then all I could hear was breath, collective, waiting. I looked out at the room and spoke the first words from memory, no notes. 2 months ago, I woke up in a hospital bed, unsure of where I was. Within days, I realized the truth was worse than any diagnosis. My family had buried me. Not in the ground. On paper. They held a memorial. They moved to sell my company. They forged my name, my death, and everything I built. A few gasps echoed from the audience. I paused and let the silence hold. But I didn't come here today to relive what was done. I came to share what I learned about legacy, about betrayal, and about what happens when you refuse to disappear. I talked for 30 minutes, never once looking at the outline I brought. I told them about waking up to an empty hospital room, about walking into my own funeral, about the silence of those I trusted most, and the voices that rose up when I needed them. Joe, Elaine, Claire, Frank. I spoke about restoration, not revenge, and the power of standing back up even when no one expects you to, even when no one wants you to. When I finished, the room was completely still. Then a single clap. Then more. Not wild applause, just honest recognition. Respect. Afterward, people approached quietly. A woman in her 70s with tear-rimmed eyes said, "My son did something similar. Not as public, but just as cruel. Thank you for speaking out." Another man simply shook my hand and said, "You reminded me to stop letting my silence serve the wrong people." That night, I didn't return home right away. I walked the long way back through downtown. The breeze carried a chill, but it was clean. The streets were familiar now, not just in memory, but in spirit. They'd seen me fall. They'd seen me return. And now they saw me whole. I reached my front steps just as the porch light blinked on automatically. For the first time in a long time, I smiled at it. I was home not just in place, but in presence. Not dead, not defeated, alive, and absolutely unburied. A few days after the community center event, I found myself sitting in my old office at the company now freshly repainted, sun streaming in through the windows. The same windows I once stared out of during long nights wondering if I was building something that would last. The desk still bore the slight gouge from when I slammed my first set of blueprints down in frustration years ago. It felt good to sit here again. Not as a symbol, not as a ghost returned, but as a man who had taken back his name. Joe walked in without knocking like he always had. "Morning, Ron," he said, setting a warm coffee on the desk. "Got a new intern coming in today. Thought you'd want to meet him." "Absolutely," I said. "What's his name?" "Darren. Former Navy. Quiet but sharp. Reminds me a little of myself back then." I smiled. "Then let's make sure he gets a real chance." We spent the next hour reviewing a few internal operations. Things had changed since I'd been gone, but not so much that it couldn't be fixed. We tightened a few roles, scrapped a bloated vendor contract Kristen had introduced, and drafted a clearer set of values for new hires. Not just performance-based, but integrity-based. If I was going to rebuild this place, it had to reflect what I learned, that character matters more than resume polish. Around lunch, I walked through the shop floor. Employees looked up from their desks from blueprints and spreadsheets. Some smiled, others nodded. A few whispered, "Good to have you back, boss." But no one gawked anymore. I wasn't the miracle man from the headlines. I was just Ron again, the man who asked for accountability and showed up early. That was all I ever wanted. Outside, I paused in the parking lot watching as trucks were loaded for the day's deliveries. One of the drivers, Miguel, waved. He'd been there since the beginning. I waved back and realized I knew all of their names, not just their titles. That meant something. The culture Mark tried to replace with spreadsheets and sleek presentations was still alive. Bruised, maybe, but breathing. As I stood there, Elaine pulled up in her car. She stepped out, sunglasses in hand. "Frank called me," she said. The state bars opened a formal inquiry into Kristen's lawyer. "Your complaint held up." I raised an eyebrow. "So it's official, it's public," she replied, "and irreversible." She handed me a printed email. It was confirmation of the investigation and notice that the attorney had been suspended pending review. I stared at the page for a moment, then folded it and placed it in my pocket. "They thought they were untouchable," I said. "They were wrong." Elaine smiled. "They picked the wrong man to bury." We stood in the sunlight for a long beat, not rushing. Everything didn't have to be urgent anymore. It just had to be true. The cleanup wasn't finished. But the foundation, this company, the people who stayed, was solid. We were done reacting. We were building again. The day Kristen's attorney was disbarred, I didn't celebrate. I didn't open a bottle of scotch or call anyone. I didn't even tell Joe. I just sat on my porch as the mail truck passed the neighborhood, quiet, except for the breeze rustling through the maple trees. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that doesn't come with applause. It comes with stillness, with knowing. Kristen had disappeared from town life entirely. Word was she and Mark had moved out of state somewhere in Arizona or maybe the Carolinas. I didn't care to verify. They weren't part of my story anymore. They were a footnote, a warning, a lesson. The real work, the rebuilding, was here. That weekend, we hosted a company-wide picnic at Riverside Park. I hadn't planned to give a speech, but someone handed me a microphone after the sandwiches were served, and the laughter had settled into a gentle hum. I stood beneath an old oak tree and looked out over the team new hires, Veterans, their kids chasing one another through the grass. I won't speak long, I began, because I've already said what needed to be said. But I will say this. When people try to bury you, they're betting on your silence. Don't give it to them. Speak. Show up. Stand. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to be honest and relentless. They clapped not for the spectacle, but for the journey we'd all endured. That night, I stood at my kitchen counter, sorting through the last box I hadn't opened since returning home. Inside were photos, old ones. Me and Mark fishing when he was a boy. Christmases where Kristen still smiled without calculation. There was a time we were a family. That part had been real once. But real doesn't always last. Sometimes people change. Sometimes they reveal who they've been all along. I kept one photo, a black and white print of the original crew on our first construction site, and threw the rest back in the box. Some memories were lessons, not keepsakes. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I glanced once more at the framed mission statement hanging by the front door. I'd rewritten it just a week ago. The last line read, "We do honest work with people we trust. Nothing else lasts." I meant it. I believe it. And for the first time in a long while, I slept through the night without waking once. No dreams, no ghosts, just the steady breath of a man who had lost everything, then took it back with clarity, grit, and truth. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own noise. But tonight I rested in silence. Not the kind that follows betrayal. The kind that follows justice. The kind that belongs to the living. If there's anything this journey taught me, it's that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and silence never saves you from betrayal. Sometimes the people closest to you will be the ones who twist the knife quietly, efficiently, and with a smile. But if you stand back up, tell your truth, and hold the line, you'll find that dignity is something no one can forge or steal. Maybe you're a parent who's felt erased, or a child who's been underestimated so think twice before staying silent. Have you ever lived through something like this? How did you handle it? What did you learn? Share your story in the comments, and if mine meant something to you, like, subscribe and spread the word. Thank you for listening.